Welcome to Convention Reviews. Today we'll be talking about Otakon 2026. This is an annual anime con that occurs at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C. Otakon is one of the oldest anime-centric conventions on the East Coast, although I will say in more recent years the convention has been diversifying much more heavily into K-pop, Dunhwa, and other Asian pop culture, which has definitely been on the rise for the last few years. The main theme of Otakon this year was sort of a Dungeons & Dragons theme with a lot of sort of side events happening with this theme throughout the weekend. One thing that was a little bit of a disappointment this year was that there was no Thursday Matsuri Festival, which tends to kick off the convention for the last couple of years, and instead the Smithsonian Museum of Asian Art held a movie for Chow, which was pretty fun to say the least. Another major change that happened this year was that the AMV theater was drastically cut down in size compared to previous years, and even the way it was run was a little bit weird compared to previous years. And a lot of the content that was in place of the AMV theater was replaced with a lot of VTubers this year. I will say personally, I'm not really familiar with a lot of them outside of Iron Mouse, but a lot of people had a lot of fun, but there was quite a few technical difficulties for a lot of the mainstay events throughout Otakon this year for some reason. One of the main returning exhibits this year was the Itasha Car Show. This is a really large collection of anime-wrapped cars and vehicles that really have a lot of really interesting appeal to a lot of anime fans and has really been growing as a fandom over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's really interesting to see the level of art and creativity that goes into a lot of these designs, because the thing is that it's not just a lot of super mainstream titles, which there were many, but there were also a lot of really interesting features that were also thrown onto these, such as little turtle tops, as well as some banners and other sort of accoutrements that kind of go on to this as well. One of the other things that also kind of makes this really cool is that there also are a handful of Japanese import vehicles. So some of them are K-trucks, which are basically imported vehicles that are kind of not street legal in many states. They have to be 20 years old to be driven here, but there also are some really interesting little vehicles that basically there aren't really an apples for apples equivalent here. And like I said, the selection was really massive. There certainly were a handful of repeats I've seen from previous years, but it's always cool to see a bunch of brand new Itasha cars and seeing what people have. I think some of the more interesting ones I saw this year was somebody had a Gurren Lagann as well as an Otto, which is a very popular Japanese singer. There also was somebody who had wrapped their car in a Flash cartoon that I vaguely remember from the 2000s, which was pretty fun too. So, I mean, it really is kind of one of those things that you can really go in any real direction with these particular vehicles. So it definitely was a lot of fun to say the least. But outside of that, the gaming room, once again, was very massive, had a lot of really great selection of, pinball games, classic Japanese arcade games, as well as some more newer ones, and really had a really great area for also taking pictures as well, which there were quite a few throughout the event space as well, which really kind of had a lot there, especially if you're a huge gamer, to say the least. There were also a lot of video game tournaments that also occurred in this space as well. Like I said, this space is literally the size of an airplane hangar, so it is amazing how much stuff they can fit into this one gigantic hallway, and as well as there being some food stands towards the back. One thing that was pretty cool about this year was that they had a really cool promotion for Magical Knight Rayearth, where they had a stamp rally where you had to go around and collect stamps from various different info booths throughout the event, which was pretty fun to collect. At the end, you got a little tchotchke prize, which was pretty fun. Outside of that, they also had this fun kind of D&D kind of search game for these picture frames that you could play games for, and you basically won better prizes the more of these things you found, which was a fun game for people who are really big into collecting limited edition Otakon merch. Returning this year was Mecha Kaikon, a track that specifically is devoted to Gundam and other mech-related materials that was very popular throughout the event. There also was a really fun little arts and crafts room, as well as Otakon did have one or two video rooms, although I will say it was a little bit smaller than I've seen in previous years. One of the unique guests that Otakon invited this year was a craftsman who works on food replicas, which was really interesting to see. He had a few different segments throughout the weekend, basically kind of going through his process of making essentially a lot of artificial food for restaurants to show, but also some other aspects of that was a little bit more artistic, which I found to be really interesting to learn about, since this is really a subject you don't really see at a lot of other events. Several industry guests also came to Otakon this year, specifically Anamigo and Discotek Tech, which are kind of one of the last independent anime releasers left in the industry. On top of that, there also were a lot of anime-specific guests that were invited. Specifically, many people from Production IG had come to Otakon for the first time, which was pretty fun, as well as some people from Studio Orange who had worked on Trigun's Stargaze, as well as Studio Trigger, which was promoting their Cyberpunk Edge Runner series, as well as Delicious in Dungeon, which was very well attended to say the least. One of the unusual things that I did run across in the dealer's hall was a train model group that basically had a model of the Shinkansen, which apparently they're like one of the only 2 people in the country that do it. And it was kind of cool because they had like a lot of Godzilla and Evangelion stuff kind of thrown in there as well, which was a kind of a nice little treat. One of the highlights for me for Otakon was the fan panels, which occurred pretty much all weekend, and there really was a lot of really high quality content covering a variety of subjects of the cooking from Laid Back Camp, as well as Delicious in Dungeon, as well as many that covered specialty subjects like the I Knew People, as well as hobbyist subjects such as learning how to buy and maintain figurines, which has become a really big aspect of the fandom as well. There was also some fun panels on amusement parks of Japan, which was kind of a fun thing for tourism. But I will say that Otakon does have a lot of very, I will say, data-centric panels that I will say had a lot of topics involving infrastructure, the various aspects of like historical aspect of Japan post-World War II, as well as a lot of really interesting data on coin-operated arcades, as well as sort of the weird demographics that kind of make up the fandom from a more clinical side, which was really interesting, at least for me. I also want to mention really quickly the musical acts for this year's Otakon, which was a little bit of a weird mishmash. One of the big ones I will mention is that Square Enix was supposed to be doing a concert, but essentially you had to pay extra to get in here, which was the only way to get in. And the only other musical act I went to see was the K-pop performance on Sunday, which I really hate to say was arguably one of the most mediocre performances I have ever seen at an event like this. The room itself was only about half full, and it was just very, very awkward to say the least, especially if you've never been to one of these things before. And I really hope Otakon has learned some lessons from this year, because this was definitely very underwhelming to say the least. Though I will say I do have a lot of gripes with this particular year's Otakon compared to my previous year's experiences. Overall, I will say I did have a good time at this convention, and I'm sure that if anybody else was considering going to this, it's well worth your time, to say the least, and I hope this was just more of a fluke year. Also, the public transit getting to and from the convention center to the airport was relatively pretty easy. And if you've had any experiences with Otakon, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you at the next convention review.